Hey everyone, just a quick note. This episode is part of MONEYBOMB, our special series about what Citizens United did to America and what's being done to fight back. This series coincides with the release of our new book, Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America. You can get the book at levernews.com/book. If you'd like to hear other episodes from our series MONEYBOMB, be sure to check out the Lever Time feed or visit our website at levernews.com. Okay, on with the show. From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. In our last episode, you heard about the push in Congress to create a constitutional amendment overruling Citizens United, that infamous 2010 court ruling that legalized corruption and lets corporations and billionaires buy elections. It's a bold idea, but an amendment to the Constitution would require 3/4 of states, along with members of the House and Senate, to all agree, which seems like an impossible feat in the short term, even if it might end up being enacted in the long term. Now here's the good news. The fight against Citizens United is also happening in the here and now. In one ruby-red Republican-dominated state, a movement has sprung up that challenges the entire idea that we need to wait for a unified Congress, ratification from states, or a progressive Supreme Court to transform our country's campaign finance system. This new movement aims to put a measure on their state's ballot in 2026 that they say can start destroying Citizens United in the next election. How? By attacking the idea that corporations are people. In this next installment of our special series MONEYBOMB about the Citizens United era, we're going to explore the Montana plan to reform campaign finance, not just in Big Sky Country, but throughout America. That's coming up on today's episode of Lever Time.
To be able to balance our budget and not spend more than we take in, we have to make sure that the promises we make in Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare are promises we can keep.
It's 2011. Mitt Romney, the human personification of money in politics, is campaigning for president, talking to an audience at the Iowa State Fair about ways to tackle deficit spending on social programs.
And there are various ways of doing that. One is we could raise taxes on people. That's not the way.
Did you catch that? Someone in the audience suggested raising taxes on corporations instead of individuals. And in response, Romney dropped a line that I think about all the time. Corporations are people, my friend. Yes, he actually said that. And the audience wasn't having it.
We can raise taxes on. Of course they are.
The rage in the hecklers' voices echoes what a lot of people feel. How the hell can corporations be people? In a lot of ways, it's a ridiculous notion. Corporations aren't living things. But it's not a new idea. Mitt Romney was using a classic conservative talking point, that corporations legally don't need their own category. The argument is that since corporations are groups of human beings, if you raise taxes on a corporation, that tax burden supposedly trickles down to both workers and consumers. Whether it's true or not, that idea that corporations are people, my friend, that has expanded far beyond taxes. 1 year before Mitt Romney uttered that infamous line, the United States Supreme Court issued its Citizens United ruling. It decreed that corporations, like living and breathing humans, possess the First Amendment right to spend money influencing elections. For the past few weeks, we've been exploring corruption in America, the problems and the solutions, and how many of those challenges relate to the Supreme Court's 2010 Citizens United ruling. In our new book, Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America, we tell the story of how a group of conservative activists worked together in secret to deregulate the campaign finance system, which eventually led to that landmark Supreme Court ruling.
Citizens United was one of a long line of cases starting with Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976. It's just kind of been this long downward slide in terms of what the Supreme Court has allowed in our elections.
That's Tom Moore, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Tom told me there's one big difference separating people from corporations.
People are born with all their powers. People don't get powers from the government. And corporations are not like that. Corporations are created by state law.
According to Tom, the legal definition of a corporation really matters. States give corporations their powers, and what they give, they can take away. Tom Moore isn't just shooting from the hip here. He's one of the country's experts on campaign finance.
I was counsel and chief of staff to Commissioner Ellen Weintraub at the Federal Election Commission.
At the Federal Election Commission, Tom saw firsthand how the Citizens United ruling influenced electoral outcomes. But now, for the first time in his career, Tom sees a clear path to circumvent Citizens United and force dark money out of politics. His idea? Change the whole definition of what a corporation can do.
They don't exist outside the law. They start from zero. The power to own property, the power to sign contracts, every single one of those powers is given to it by the state.
Which brings us to Montana, where a bipartisan coalition of former lawmakers, academics, and strategists like Tom are now spearheading a ballot initiative that would amend the state constitution, banning corporations from spending money on politics.
We gave our corporations this many powers, just this general grant, everything. Now we're going to give them this many. And we're going to specify that this positive grant of powers we're giving does not include the power to spend in politics, that is, in ballot issues or elections. Montana is basically saying to the Supreme Court, hey, so that general grant of powers that you think included the power to spend in politics, we never meant that.
The organizers behind this initiative call their coalition the Transparent Election Initiative, and they call the ballot measure the Montana Plan. The plan hones in on the fact that the Supreme Court's decisions treating corporations as people with human rights, those decisions are predicated on state laws. And get this, the High Court has repeatedly made clear that states are the entities that ultimately create corporations. So Tom argues that by changing those state incorporation laws, those laws that the Supreme Court has already upheld, you can limit what corporations are allowed to do. He and those pushing the Montana Plan argue that if you change state law, you can limit corporations' power to spend on politics in a way that does not run afoul of the Supreme Court's First Amendment interpretation in Citizens United. The Montana Plan was recently knocked down by Montana's Republican Attorney General, who claimed that the proposal's language violated the state's so-called single question rule. That's the requirement that ballot measures only ask voters one question. But the Transparent Election Initiative is appealing that ruling. If given the green light by Montana's Supreme Court, they'll start collecting signatures to try to get the measure on the ballot for the 2026 midterms. Their plan could be one of the anti-corruption solutions that our democracy so desperately needs.
The 2024 political campaign on track to become the costliest in history, but concerns are mounting over groups that may be shielding the donors behind the donations.
The Brennan Center for Justice estimates that in the 2024 presidential election, dark money groups spent $1.9 billion to try to influence voters, $1 billion more than in 2020. Under the Montana Plan, the state could explicitly ban corporations from funding super PACs that buy elections. And proponents argue that the Montana Plan could also stretch way past Montana's own borders. The initiative could forbid an out-of-state corporation from funding deceptive political ads inside of the state. The measure seems to be quite popular. According to a brand new poll, 74% of Montanans would vote in favor of this proposed ballot measure to eliminate corporate spending in elections. And that support is bipartisan. 84% of Democrats, 69% of Republicans, and 64% of independents said they would support the measure. But how exactly would this initiative get around the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling? How precisely would it propose to redefine corporations' powers? And could other states use their legislatures or their ballot measures to pass similar laws? That's what I'm talking to Tom Moore about today. I started our conversation by asking him just to remind us of what Citizens United actually did.
Citizens United basically said, look, if you spend money independently of a candidate, you don't talk to them, you don't coordinate in any way, there's no way that that can be corrupting. Therefore, it can't be regulated, because the only way that we can regulate money in politics is if it's corrupting or it creates the appearance of corruption. And the case made a couple stunning factual declarations on that based on nothing in the record, that independent spending couldn't possibly be corrupting, couldn't possibly create the appearance of corruption, couldn't possibly hurt people's faith in democracy when they see all this. And if somebody gets influence or access to an elected official because of the money they've given, that does not corrupt that official. Those are stunning facts to just assert out of nowhere. But they drove the case. And that's been the direction that it's gone since then. The following year after the case was a case called Speech Now, which created what we think of all the time as what is one of the big legacies of Citizens United, the super PAC. Citizens United was all about, you can spend as much as you want independently, it doesn't matter. And what Speech Now did, which put all the last ingredients together, said you can bring in as much money as you want, unlimited, because if you can't corrupt somebody by spending it, you can't corrupt somebody by giving it either. So that just kind of set the stage for what we have now, which is these super PACs that are out there that can take in unlimited contributions from anyone, an American citizen or group, and then spend it in any way they choose. Now, what's interesting is there's a separate thing, a separate problem that these cases created, and it's these dark money groups. There are nonprofit organizations known as 501c4 corporations. Citizens United itself was a Virginia nonprofit that got this 501c4 tax treatment from the IRS. It basically means you don't have to pay taxes. You're a nonprofit group, but people can't deduct from their taxes contributions they give to you either. You're this social welfare group that can do lobbying, it can do all kinds of issue work and that kind of thing, but shouldn't spend all of its money on politics. And these dark money groups don't have to disclose their donors, and that's the problem. Since Citizens United was decided, giant amounts of money have poured through these C4 groups, either been spent directly by the C4 groups on elections or been poured into super PACs. And the super PACs, they are political action committees. They're political committees. They have to register with the Federal Election Commission. They do have to disclose their donors. But when your donor is a dark money group, that's the only thing that's listed. There's no real disclosure. So that's the world that we've ended up with, where all of a sudden we're getting gigantic amounts of independent spending in these races. And the idea was, if you don't coordinate, then it can't be a problem.
Right. I mean, and allegedly independent. I put independent in quotes, like the idea that some super PAC supporting some senator's election run by that senator's former aides is independent from that senator is to my mind, at best, a legal fiction. But the ballot measure that you're helping spearhead in Montana revolves around what corporations are allowed to do, what powers they are granted, and what powers they aren't granted. Because, as you argue, a lot of this stuff relies on the assumption that corporations are people.
Yeah, but it's close, but not quite.
And we'll get into the details. But this idea that whether you call it corporate personhood, corporations are effectively people. Just talk to us a little bit about that. When did corporations become somewhat like people under the law? Why is that important to this whole issue of corruption?
The thing we got to start with is that people are born with all their powers. People don't get powers from the government. In a democracy, people give powers to the government. That's where the government gets its legitimacy. And corporations are not like that. Corporations are created by state law, not federal law, state law. And they're created out of whole cloth by state law. Before there was a corporate code and any state law, there were no corporations. And if you cut those sections of state law out tomorrow, there would be no corporations.
To be clear, I want people to understand that when corporations are chartered, created by states, the reason why there is that situation is because the states are giving special privileges to these like it's not, for instance, I always think about the power of so-called limited liability, right? Like that if the company goes bankrupt, it doesn't necessarily mean the individual executives or or everyone else goes
staff.
Right, exactly. Right. So the point here is that the reason it's set up this way is because in exchange for getting these special privileges,
Mhm.
the state gets to say, you have this and this power, but maybe you don't have this and this power, and you have to follow all these kinds of rules.
Exactly. And so this limited list of powers turned out to be kind of unwieldy. And states kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s started competing with each other to get corporations to charter themselves in their states. And they started ratcheting up what they would give. And basically New Jersey finally said, like, fine, we'll just give you everything. Like, you have all the powers of a natural person.
Right. So New Jersey was like the original Delaware.
The original race to the bottom.
Yeah, exactly.
And so every other state was like, oh, geez. So everybody matched that. And that's where it stood for the last 100 years. And then Delaware won. Like, they won out over everybody else. And for some good reasons. They've got a good court system. They've got an established body of law. There are good reasons to incorporate in Delaware. They don't even have the lowest tax rate. That's not how they compete. But Delaware won the race. And all the other states kept their corporate powers where they had set them when they were competing. And nobody has touched those for 100 years. But every state has a section of its law that it's had in since basically the 1820s or whenever it was first joined the Union that says, we reserve the power to change up your powers at any time. We can take things off the list. We can get rid of you altogether. And the Supreme Court has said for 200 years that states' authority to do that, because they put that in their laws, that states' authority to do that is absolute. It's plenary. It is unquestioned. And they have never overturned a state's decision to issue some power or another power to its corporations. The court has said they can do it for good reasons, no reasons, or bad reasons. It doesn't matter who it hurts. The power to do it is kind of astonishing if you're familiar with other areas of law that are usually very constrained. And so that is the key to this. And basically, states have had this power sitting in their back pocket, unnoticed, gathering dust for 100 years.
After the break, Tom Moore gives us an on-the-ground look at what's happening in Montana and how the new ballot initiative could be the populist push needed to transform our country's campaign finance system. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Lever Time. I'm talking with Tom Moore, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. It's come up once in a while. I remember back in college reading about, for instance, California had been asked to revoke the corporate charter of Unocal, the oil company. Periodically, once in a while, it comes up where people say to their state government, hey, you've got the power to dissolve a company, but it's been dormant.
But this is kind of taking a step back. It's like the law that creates those corporations, that empowers the charters. Let's take a look at that.
So the question then is, how does that relate to the campaign finance system in particular and the ballot measure that is being proposed in Montana?
Basically, in Citizens United, the nonprofit, Virginia chartered nonprofit, shows up in court. And the Supreme Court looks at it and says, okay, you're Virginia chartered nonprofit that's been given the power to do everything that a natural person can do. And natural people have the ability to spend in politics, so you must have that power. And therefore, you must have the right to do it. And that's how the case proceeded from there. And the people who have associated together through this corporation, because the corporation has the power and the right to it, can express their political views through spending through this corporation. That's how that proceeded. But if you went back and asked the people in Virginia who passed that law 100 years ago and said, like, hey, do you think that by giving them these general grants of power that you're giving them the power to spend an unlimited amount of money in elections? They would be astonished. So this is how we get to Montana. Basically, there's a constitutional ballot initiative moving in Montana. And here's the thing that's kind of striking about this is that it's local, state, and federal elections. It's a state law change that can no longer grant the power to spend in federal elections to its corporations.
So companies in Montana that are operating in and incorporated in Montana,
right?
If this ballot measure passes, the new corporate law would say you can do basically everything you've been doing when it comes to your business.
Right.
But the one power that we, the state, are not granting you is you cannot spend out of your corporate treasury money on elections for all these offices and on ballot measures. And I think what's interesting is that Montana has had a really important history when it comes to corruption. Why don't you tell us that history and why you think it's important in particular here?
The Anaconda Copper Company basically ran the state for a period in the early 1900s, shut down the state for a while in there, bullied the legislature into sending its senator to Washington. And it was awful.
I think it was like handing out money bags. The legislature was had to elect the senator, and the senator basically bought the seat with the
Exactly.
I mean, it's like a cartoon of corruption.
Exactly. They passed an incredibly strong bill that basically just kept corporations out of politics altogether. And so Citizens United comes along in 2010 and says, like, oh, no, you can't do that. Montana went back to the Supreme Court in 2012 and said, we've had an unbelievable history of corporate corruption in our politics. Can we please keep this restriction? And they struck it down, one-page decision, basically just saying, like, no, Citizens United, that's it. And people in Montana are not real happy about that. Soon after that, they passed a ballot initiative that year that basically said corporations are not people. There's a whole bunch of things in there that basically said, no, this is not what we want. And it passed basically 75-25 that year.
And people will hear that and think, well, Montana's like this Republican red state, but it doesn't mean its politics on the issue of corruption is kind of what you might imagine a Republican state would be if you think the Republicans are all corrupt.
Yeah.
Like I have a different understanding of how anti-corruption politics actually works here. I think rank and file conservative voters are just as angry at corruption as rank and file liberal progressive voters, even if they disagree on different issues. I think this is like the one unifying issue. Money in politics, people do not like it across the board. And that's why I think it's so fascinating that it's happening in Montana.
So one thing real fast, there's a cherry on top here that's in the state law that actually makes this all work, because I think anybody who's heard this discussion up until now, they'll say, well, what about Delaware? All the corporations are in Delaware, and aren't they just going to spend in Montana's politics?
Right. I was just going to ask about that because I wrote about this in a recent Rolling Stone piece, and I heard a lot of people, well, people, hey, listen, that may be nice. Companies in Montana that either are willing to just leave and never come back can move out and move to Delaware and spend wherever they want other than in Montana, or even arguably they can just reincorporate out of Montana and spend into Montana. So talk to us about whether that two-step, if you will, that evasion circumvention step is applicable here.
Yeah, it's not, because there's a provision that's in almost every state's law, and those that don't have it can add it. I think there's 4 states or so. This provision says, and it makes sense, no out-of-state corporation can exercise any power in this state that a domestic corporation can't exercise. So if you're a Delaware corporation and you want to spend in Montana's politics, but Montana's corporations cannot, then you cannot. And it's something that we don't think about, because all the corporations have had all the power to do everything they want everywhere, and all the other states recognize that, and they're all good to each other, and they recognize each other's corporations. And it's all been the same for 100 years. If you're a corporation in Delaware that wants to operate, not even spend politics, operate in Montana, who gives you the authority to do that? Is it Delaware or is it Montana? And you think, well, it's Delaware because they created it and they set all these things up and so forth. But no, it's Montana, because Delaware and Montana are sovereigns. They cannot affect what happens in the other state. If a Delaware corporation operates in Montana, it's because Montana said it could, and Montana sets the rules for that. When states have gotten in trouble on that, it's when they tried to favor the hometown guys against and advantage them over the out-of-state guys. Can't do that. That's the Interstate Commerce Clause. That's a bunch of different federal constitutional violations. Can't do that. But if you're treating everybody the same, you've got it.
What I hear you saying is that states like Montana or any other state that passes something like this can take a big step towards saying, listen, we can't solve the problem in other states, but we can take a step forward inside of our state in a way that's meaningful, and we don't necessarily have to wait for all the other states for it to be meaningful.
Right.
I mean, I think that's the part that I think people have trouble wrapping their head around, that this isn't, and we'll get into why this doesn't solve the whole problem, but this is a meaningful step forward that doesn't require all other 49 states to do something for it to be meaningful inside of your own state.
Right. If this passes in Montana in November 2026, January 1st, 2027, if it doesn't get enjoined by a court, every corporation on the planet will no longer be empowered to spend in Montana's politics, local, state, federal, ballot issues, nothing. Their politics will be cleaned of all the corporate and dark money, and they're good. They don't care what's happening in Wyoming. If no other state ever passes this, the people of Montana will be delighted, and they'll have better politics, and they won't have to worry at any level that somebody's going to take some position and they're going to be primaried from the further out in their party because all this dark money will pour into the race. They won't have to worry about that anymore. It's kind of remarkable. And just to be clear about it, if Montana were to pass this, it doesn't affect what a Delaware corporation does in Florida or Delaware corporation does in Texas or in what a Delaware corporation does in Delaware. But it does affect what a Delaware corporation or any other corporation does in Montana. And the law behind that is unbelievably solid. As long as you treat them the same, which this does, you are on incredibly solid legal ground.
So I think the question on the technical implementation of this comes down to, let's use an example of television ads, because money buying elections, a lot of what we're saying when we use those phrases is money buys lots of TV ads to make certain candidates more well-known to the voters and other candidates well-known in a negative way.
Sure.
So one question that's come up is, what does this do to stop the corporation that doesn't like this from moving, let's say, Delaware? They move to Delaware. They want to spend a lot on ads against some Senate candidate running in Montana. They pay a national cable company or a big television company to put their ads onto TV, which gets beamed into Montana, right? Like we do it at a certain level, live in a nationalized information environment. So talk to us about how this plays out.
Sure. Basically, there's three kinds of corporations in the world from the standpoint of Montana. Corporations that are chartered there, and it's like, okay, we got that full power over those guys. Corporations that do business in Montana already, they're doing so they have to register with the state.
Right. So some giant oil conglomerate that also that's doing operations that may not be headquartered there, but it's operating in Montana.
Yeah, or Walmart that has a store there.
Right.
I mean, like anybody like that has to register with the state. And basically, if Montana passed this and you continue spending in politics, if you're a Montana corporation, they can yank your charter altogether. It's the corporate death penalty.
Right.
Your officers and your directors can be sued personally if your corporation goes beyond its powers. If you're not a state corporation, you can have your license to operate as a corporation yanked within Montana, which means you can still operate there, but you don't get all those goodies, all those privileges that we talked about earlier, limited liability and so forth. So if somebody slips and falls, outside of Walmart, if that's happened, they can lead to personal liability of other folks in the organization. And then there's a third category, which is kind of tricky. And this one it's a little hardest to deal with. It's, okay, what if you're just a dark money C4 operating out of a post office box in Arlington, Virginia, and you want to spend a ton of money in Montana? The way they wrote it up in Montana, there's a sentence in there that basically says, most state laws have a long list of things that do not cause you to have to register in the state. If you're just selling stuff on Amazon, you don't have to register in the state. If there's just regular commerce, you don't have to. This is kind of an exception to that, where it says, okay, if you are spending money in our politics, you are presumptively doing business in our state and you have to register. And if you have to register, then you can't spend politics in our state. So it's a little bit of there are some analogs to that in laws dealing with foreign agents. So if you're doing this, you got to register, and if you register, you can't do that.
So if I'm sitting there, I'm running a dark money group out of a PO box in Virginia, and I want to use that PO box to just pay a bunch of Montana television stations or a national television conglomerate that owns a lot of Montana television stations. I want to pay them to put my ad on saying Senator Joe Schmo is a terrible person. I may not be able to do that at minimum without saying who I am.
Yeah. And in some ways you would, if you do that, you are a political committee as far as Montana is concerned. I mean, there are ways to do this. We had an event at CAP last week, and Jeff Mangan, the guy who's running this effort in Montana, was there. And Sarah Hahn, who's a Brooklyn law professor and an expert on all this, was talking. And she brought up something that I had not thought of before, which is if you're a corporation or even like a dark money group and this kind of thing, your insurers are not going to let you exercise powers beyond what you're allowed to, beyond the powers that you've been given.
Because they're going to be on them.
They will. And basically, it's like, I was thinking like the lawyers would just say like, you do that and I quit. But the insurers are going to be all over these guys as well. There's very little then this concept of ultra vires, beyond the powers. If we haven't really had that in American corporate law for 100 years because they have the power to do everything legal. If they do anything up here, it's just illegal. You can go after them with criminal law. And this creates a little bit of distance between what's legal and what they have powers to do. In that space in there, they can get the corporate death penalty. And that is something that just hasn't been something that corporations have faced for 100 years. But it's all still in the law. It is all still totally valid. The Supreme Court has never, ever told a state that it couldn't go after a corporation that had gone beyond its powers.
So this opens up a whole new, if it passes, a whole new legal frontier. Just to double check, because I think people will be hearing this and say, well, it's nice that Montana's doing this. Can my state do this? Does my state even have to go to the ballot? It seems to me, you tell me if I'm wrong, that if you're listening to this and you're living in a blue state, as an example, and I only cite the blue states because the Democratic Party sort of officially, in rhetoric, if you will, I'm not saying I buy it in action, but in rhetoric, the Democratic Party seems more sympathetic, rhetorically, to taking on money in politics. In theory, if you're living in a blue state with a Democratic governor, a Democratic state legislature, you don't have to go to the ballot. You could ask your state legislatures to start passing this. Is that right?
Yes, that is, in theory, that is correct. I think in practice, everybody says they're against Citizens United and they're against dark money and they're against corporate money, and they are talking the talk just because they think that the problem can't be solved.
We're going to take one more quick break. Coming up next, I ask Tom Moore, what happens if the Montana plan passes and is blocked by federal courts? Would the Supreme Court go against its own precedents about state incorporation laws in order to try to defend its Citizens United ruling? Welcome back to Lever Time. I'm talking with Tom Moore, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. This does rely on the Supreme Court's past precedent for a very long time, essentially unchallenged Supreme Court precedent about what states can and cannot do.
Yeah.
In fact, recently, for folks who don't know this, very recently, like I think it was 2023, there was a Supreme Court case about whether states could require out-of-state corporations operating in their state to do certain things. And the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court, right? We're not talking about like the Earl Warren Court. We're talking about the John Roberts Court, was basically like, and I'm summarizing here, but was basically like, yes, states are allowed to grant and not grant certain powers and requirements to corporations operating in their state.
And better than that, even, Justice Alito in Hobby Lobby, that was the case. It was a statutory interpretation case that basically gave corporations the ability to express religious preferences in what they do. He said in there, it's like, oh, well, states give the corporations all their powers. They actually said it. And that, and this is, when you go back to that, if you're wondering what a corporation can do. In his concurrence in Citizens United itself, Justice Scalia was making fun of some folks in the dissent who were talking about the common law. And he said, no, but those are situations where, they did not have the power to do this thing. And in this case, they do. And which means the opposite can be, is operative, which is that they don't have the power, then they don't have the ability to do that. So it has run through all of these cases, but never kind of laid out just like this.
Now let's talk honestly about the way the Supreme Court operates. I mean, this whole idea, it's under the rubric of stare decisis, right? Which is respect for past precedent. As I'm not a lawyer, but that's how I understand it. And the Supreme Court, this current court, has shown very little respect for past precedent when it wants to do things, typically, in my view, when it wants to stand with corporate power.
Yeah, and that's the key. So this court, violates past precedent, and it doesn't, the standing, Article 3 standing is very fluid, and all these things.
Right, it feels like they wake up every day and they're like, we want to do this, so, forget about what we did yesterday.
Very results-oriented, and Citizens United itself was very results-oriented. Right. But what they don't do, ever, is rule against their interests. And in this case, this is not a campaign finance regulation that's written in tissue paper and is subject to strict scrutiny and can just be flipped. It's not a regulation that can be flipped really easily. There are old cases that are at play here, but this is not like old cases that say it's illegal to use a toothbrush on Thursdays that these cases form the foundation of American corporate law. In order to get to this and flip it, they would have to undo the statement that corporations are creatures of state law.
Right.
They either are or they're not. And they would have to kind of assign natural rights to corporations, entities that do not exist in the U.S. Constitution, barely existed at the time of the Revolution. And So they would have to, this would be really hard for them to do. And there's some structural things about this too.
I think about it metaphorically as like the Jenga game.
Yeah.
Like if they pull this, if they try to not respect the precedent of corporations being created by state law and they pull that brick out, there's all this other corporate law that they like that could sort of tumble apart. But I do want to push you on that.
Yep.
When I wrote my piece summarizing this for Rolling Stone, there were some people who were like, be careful what you wish for. Aren't you accidentally giving the Supreme Court a way to manufacture out of thin air a sort of federal corporations are human beings kind of precedent? Now, I ask you this question, and I want to preface it by saying I do not generally believe in the idea that somebody in the future can do something unimaginably bad, so we shouldn't try to do anything here in the present. Like, I don't buy that.
Right.
But I just wonder what you say about that. Like, is this teeing up the court to do something even worse?
So there's two things here. One is that corporations are created by state law, but also that it is state law, that the feds it has no jurisdiction there. If they were to establish federal jurisdiction over that kind of state corporate law, that doesn't just stick to the facts of that case. That means President AOC at some point can do X, Y, and Z to state corporations using the power of the federal government, which never existed before that. In some ways, this is a lot of bad things could happen, but they're not bad things for progressives, which is why I don't think the Supreme Court will do it, because it would be so destabilizing. And it's the reason all the corporations go to Delaware, right? Because they like stable law, they like things to be predictable and so forth. For the Supreme Court to start pulling absolute foundational building blocks from the base of corporation law, they're not going to want to do that. When I do think about the implications of, if they did, it's like those are also bad for conservatives and not progressives particularly. They are bad for business interests and not for other folks.
So I want to ask, as we conclude here, I want to ask a question that has come up in my mind when I've read about this. And I should say, we'll include in our show notes a link to your detailed writing on this so people can see the really granular details about this. But I think one question's come up. If this is such a viable option, why has it taken so long for it to emerge, right? I mean, Citizens United has been around for now 15 years. Like, what took everyone so long?
My answer is, I don't know. But what I do know is that I worked on it for a decade before I got to this. Like, in some ways, my wife has been tossing me some cool quotes along this way. It's like, simplicity is not your first step, it's your last step. It's like you have to work really hard to get to simplicity. This fell together after a number of different things I worked on, a number of different approaches to it, and this just kind of came together. There's a lot of silos in the law. And corporate law folks don't talk to campaign finance folks. They don't talk to election law folks. And the metaphor I think of is a wall-to-wall carpet over a hardwood floor. If you've got wall-to-wall carpet over every inch in your house, then the floors are there, but you don't talk about them. You're like, we're going to vacuum the carpets. We're going to pull up the carpets. We're going to do this and that. You've got these carpets, and it's functionally not interesting or useful to talk about the floors because you're dealing with the carpets every day. That's kind of like what it is here, where basically there is this underlying like state recognition of state corporations, but that doesn't matter because we've got this, it just looks like a bunch of national corporations with unlimited powers. And that's the way it's been as long as anybody's been alive. And so that's the only way that we need to think about it.
Your point about simplicity is something that I think about a lot. It's sort of like an obsession of mine, like this idea that like I feel like particularly Democrats in politics and in government are constantly trying to complicate things, in many cases in the pursuit of precision.
Right.
And I think about this Steve Jobs quote all the time. There's actually two great Steve Jobs quotes, and I want to read them because I think it's important to think about it through the prism of politics. Steve Jobs once said, "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It takes a lot of hard work to make something truly simple, to truly understand the underlying challenges and come up with elegant solutions. It's not just minimalism or the absence of clutter. It involves digging through the depth of complexity. To be truly simple, you have to go really deep." And he said, simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple.
Yeah.
And I think about American politics, and it's particularly Democratic politics. Everything's being means tested, and I've got a 1,000-page bill, and we're going to get the this or that to work specifically properly. You lose another metaphor, you lose the forest through the trees.
Yeah.
And I think you've come upon something and I'm not blaming you for being belated, but I think
Right.
this is belated, like, okay, where it's a pretty late hour for democracy to
Sure.
come upon this. But I think you've come upon something, this idea that we get to say what powers corporations are granted, this very old, dormant, legally enshrined idea. You've come upon this, and it's so simple that I think the challenge you may have, frankly, is that people won't believe it's that simple. Like, what do you say to people who are like, come on, man, there's got this, you can't be telling me the truth here, because it can't be that simple.
I actually don't get that a lot, because actually people are so delighted. I have answers to a lot of different questions on this,
Right.
But it is simple, but it's simple in a way that people get. You hear it and you're like, well, that should work. And then when you dive into it really deeply, it works. And so I think it's something that yes, cynics may have that kind of reaction to it, but most people are just delighted and want to know how they can get it going in their state.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that there's such demoralization out there that getting over the hump of, wait a minute, we can actually do something. There's like a believability part of this. And I do think that people are thrilled to hear, rightly so, that actually there are lots of ways, things that can be done to deal with what we call at the lever, the master plan, to legalize corruption. It feels like it's been going on so long that we're on the verge of the master plan and legalized corruption becoming so normal that people presume nothing can be done. What I love about this is that it opens up a whole new realm of possibility that I think people have perceived has not existed. And we will link to the ballot measure in our show notes. I want people to check it out.
Yeah.
We will link to your deep dive that people can read and pass on to their own state legislators, their own folks in their states. Tom Moore is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where, as he said, he focuses on democracy and government reform. Tom, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for your work on this.
Dave, it's my pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to talk about it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lever Time. Check out our new book, Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America, where we tell the wild story of how Citizens United gutted our campaign finance system. Get the book by using the link in our show notes or by visiting levernews.com/book. To learn more about the Montana plan discussed in this episode, please check out our show notes. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Ariella Markowitz. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. For ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in this episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.